We are in the midst of Advent. We're looking back at the narrative of Jesus coming, and we're looking forward to Jesus' return, his second coming. Today, we're going to be in Revelation chapter 22. And let me start by reading for us the first 5 verses. And so we'll read it, and then I'll unpack those verses. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They'll see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There'll be no more night. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. They will see his face. What a promise. They will see his face. The scholar of world religions, Justin Smith, once wrote that in the history of the world, there have only been 2 religious teachers have lived in such a way that their followers have asked the question, not just who are you, but what are you? Not just who are you, but what are you? One was the Buddha. The other was the child whose birth we celebrate at Christmas, Jesus of Nazareth. When it comes to Jesus, his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection, we're confronted with a paradox. It's a paradox that anyone who looks into the story of Jesus is confronted with. It's a paradox or perhaps a tension that we feel every Christmas. And there's this paradox, this conflict, this tension. On the one hand, we read about Jesus and we encounter the brilliance and the power of his moral teaching, the depth of the riches of the explosive power of how and what he taught. And often that's acknowledged by anyone who looks into the matter, regardless of upbringing or religious persuasion. It's the reason why even some hostile critics of Christianity, like atheist Richard Dawkins, will wear a t-shirt that says, "Atheist for Jesus." Why? Because of the brilliance of Jesus' teaching. And it's not just his teaching, it's the fact that he lived out his teaching. He taught with humility and service to others. He was humble and served others. He taught love for those on the margins, and he practiced it. He taught enemy love, and he forgave those who were crucifying him. It's a stunning teaching. It's a beautiful life, and it's why Gandhi once said something along the lines of, "I love your Jesus, I'm just not sure about your Christians." It's because of Jesus' teaching and his life that though we might not be religious, we're happy to attend the odd religious service, particularly around Christmas and Easter, to celebrate this Jesus. People are going to sing traditional carols. They're going to do Silent Night. They're going to sing the words, "Jesus, Lord, at thy birth." I don't mind doing that. But sooner or later, whether it's culturally or as individuals, we're confronted with the problem with the same records from which we pull these celebrated teachings and morals, and the beauty of his life also contains some profound theological statements out of the mouth of Jesus that take our breath away. And these claims are scattered throughout his public ministry. They exist in all of the Gospels and at every layer of textual evidence. And sometimes it's just a simple interaction where you know Jesus doesn't just forgive sins against them, he forgives people's sins against one another, which is a little weird, right? If you sin against me, I can forgive you, but I can't forgive you for your sin against someone else. I've no right to do so. If I tried, you'd be offended. The only one who can forgive those sins is the one who's been impacted by all sins. The only one who's been impacted by all sins is God. And so with that statement, when Jesus pronounces forgiveness of sins, he's casually replacing the temple, which was the place where Jewish people in the first century went to deal with their sins. And he's pronouncing forgiveness, putting himself in the place of God. And that's how his original hearers understood him, and they were shocked. In one parable or story, Jesus claims to be the one sending prophets into history. He talks about being the judge of the earth in another. And then there's those famous "I am" statements. To name just a few, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I'm the one who satisfies your deepest spiritual hunger. I'm the light of the world. I illuminate the face of God and light up the darkness through my life and my love. I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though they die. I will conquer death, and so will those who trust in me. Do you feel the tension there? On the one hand, you have the depth, the wisdom, the power, and the insight of his moral teaching. On the other hand, you have these extraordinary claims he makes about himself. How do you reconcile that tension? Is he brilliant and wise, but also totally detached from reality? You can't be both, can you? People who believe they're God, we put them in institutions. They're also not the best and the brightest moral teachers in history, right? Now, those categories, they don't overlap. And so you feel the tension. And anyone who looks seriously at the Gospels and these written records about Jesus' life and ministry, and some have said the answer's simple. Jesus didn't make those claims about himself. His followers exaggerated the story. They put words in his mouth, and a legend grew up around him. Fair enough, that's a possibility. And that theory became really popular in the 19th century. And there was some large movement of German scholars who tried to divorce the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith. They wedged between the historical Jesus and the mythology that grew up around him. There was no new evidence. It was just a new idea. And this various over the last 100 years or so, whether it was scholars like Rudolf Bultmann and his demythologizing, or the Jesus seminar in the 90s. It was a thing that people did. But when this theory was first proposed in the 19th century, a scholar by the name of Julius Müller challenged his 19th century colleagues to produce a single example in history of a great myth or a legend arising from a historical figure and being generally believed within a short period, within 30 years of that figure's death, when plenty of eyewitnesses were still around to contradict exaggerated claims. Myths and legends do grow up around historical figures. It does happen. But it turns out it often takes a century or two, once all those who were alive at the time have died off. And the New Testament documents date much earlier. These things that were believed about Jesus from the very beginning. And it turns out that Mueller's challenge is very difficult to answer, and the problems with this theory are many. Let me just mention a couple. Jesus' first followers were Jewish, and for centuries, Jewish people were strictly monotheistic. In the Greco-Roman world, people were happy to add one more god to the pantheon. Conquer a people, take on their gods. No more problem. The more the merrier. Janice and I were in Greece and Turkey this fall, and as we toured ancient sites, there were statues and engravings to gods and more gods. The Jewish people did not collect gods. Dating back to at least the time of the prophets like Isaiah in the Old Testament, hundreds of years before the coming of Jesus, the Jewish people were reminded again and again, there's only one God to worship, and any created thing as God is idolatry, breaking the first of the 10 Commandments. It'd be very strange to believe that Jewish followers of Jesus would create a story about a crucified Messiah being God and then worship him. They were the one people group in the entire ancient world and least likely to make such a mistake. Number two, the Gospels don't read like myths and legends. To claim the Gospels are legends is a confusion about the literary genre. And you can test this statement by reading things like Grimm's fairy tales or Aesop's fables. C.S. Lewis was primarily a literary critic and historian, and he pointed this out. He wrote, now, as a literary historian, I'm perfectly convinced that whatever else the Gospels are, they are not legends. I've read a great deal of legend, and I'm quite clear that they're not the same sort of thing. They are not artistic enough to be legends. And from an imaginative point of view, they are clumsy. They don't work up to things properly. And most of the life of Jesus is totally unknown to us, as is the life of anyone else who lived at that time. And no people building up a legend would allow that to be so apart. So apart from bits of the Platonic dialogues, there's no conversation I know of in ancient literature like the fourth gospel. That's the Gospel of John. There's nothing even in modern literature until about 100 years ago. Well, now 150 years ago, when the realistic novel came into existence. Whatever else the legends are, whatever else the Gospels are, they are not legends. In fact, they're concerned with history. Look at the first verse of Luke chapter 3. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod Tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, Tetrarch of Iturea and Trachea, and Lysias Tetrarch of Albany. Luke records very specific historical details that have been confirmed by other sources. It's up there on the slide. There's there's several confirmed historical citations in that one verse, and that's very common in Luke's gospel and in his book of Acts. He's a very careful historian, and he details in his records things that have been confirmed time and time again from other sources, whether other writings or archaeological finds. He cares deeply about history. As a gospel writer, he cares. Right at the start of Luke, Luke 1, he says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the first, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught." I'm carefully investigating things so you can be confident of what you've heard. Later in his gospel, he writes in chapter 23, as the soldiers led him, that is Jesus, away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country. They put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. Luke is implying Simon's still around. Check him out. And so the New Testament documents say, the writers say, we're not creating these stories. We're not writing legends. We're reporting what we saw and what we experienced. And even though it messed with our categories and messed with our lives. So when we read that, some will say, well, they're liars. Maybe they were deceivers. But if we go that route, we're confronted with the moral goodness of Jesus' life. Most people don't want to say Jesus is a liar. Atheist for Jesus, yes. Jesus the liar, no. It's not something you want to do. And so when it comes to the disciples, we're confronted with the moral character of their lives, the honesty of the Gospels, and their obvious sincerity. The Gospels are deeply honest about the messes, about the failures of the disciples. They abandon Jesus in his hour of greatest need. They come off looking dumb and cowardly and uncaring. Peter, the leader of the disciples, is called Satan by Jesus. That's not a very good day for Peter, but it's there in the Gospel of Mark. And historically, Mark was Peter's interpreter, and he wrote down the stories that Peter told them. And Peter's like, I want you to put that story in. If they were making stuff up and felt free to tell lies, you wouldn't do that. You'd edit that out. But they didn't, because they were honest and they were committed to the truth, even when it was unflattering. And not only that, there's the obvious willingness to die for their claims. Keep in mind that if they were liars, they wouldn't be dying for something they hope to be true, like normal martyrdom shows, sincerity. If they're liars, they wouldn't have been dying for something they believed or hoped to be true, but dying or rather something they knew to be false. It doesn't make any sense. The philosopher Peter Kreeft wrote, and I like the way he puts it. He says, why would the apostles lie? If they lied, what was their motive? What did they get out of it? What they got out of it was misunderstanding and rejection and persecution and torture and martyrdom. Hardly a list of perks. It's not like a legend, not a bunch of lies. Maybe it's just lunacy. They were just unhinged. For Jesus and his first followers to be mistaken about God and then dying for that belief is to be unhinged if it's untrue. To follow a crucified rabbi declaring him to be the Lord and God, Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. That's political treason. Willing to die for that belief, that's to be unhinged if it's not true. And here again, we're confronted with the brilliant insanity, the moral teaching of the Newest Testament, especially coming out of the mouth of Jesus. Someone once remarked, no one has ever thought of the words Jesus should have said, like his answers, his interactions, his surprisingly subversive, poignant, and powerful words. It's almost like if we don't follow or worship Jesus, we should consider following those who came up with it. But nothing is the result of a mind unhindered from reality. Instead, most people, after an in-depth study of his teaching, find a mind deeply in touch with the depths of reality and the depths of the human heart. And so there's this tension. There's this paradox. It confronts us, particularly at Christmas and Easter. The brilliance of Jesus' moral teaching, generally acknowledged, and the stunning claims he made about himself. He's built different than other religious teachers. Others say, this is the truth about the universe. This is the way you ought to go. But Jesus says, I'm the truth and the way and the life. C.S. Lewis, in his book God in the Dark, says, no one can reach absolute reality except through me. If you're ashamed of me, if when you hear this call, you turn the other way, I also will look the other way when I come again as God without disguise. If anything whatever is keeping you from God and from me, throw it. Whatever it is, throw it out. If it's your eye, pull it out. If it's your hand, cut it off. If you put yourself first, you'll be last. Come to me, everyone who is carrying a heavy load. I will set that right. Your sins, all of them are wiped out. I can do that. I am rebirth. I am life. Eat me. Drink me. I am your food. Do not be afraid. I have overcome the whole universe. It's the issue. Jesus is built totally different. He is not just for the religious person, but for any student of history. The brilliance of his moral teaching, the audacity of the nature of his theological claims. So how do we reconcile these realities? If he's not legend or lies or lunacy, some can probably come up with some other options, but we're recognizing we're trying to resolve this tension in a way that doesn't unsettle our lives or change our views. We can never be totally when it comes to the evidence about Jesus. What's at stake? Always a conflict of interest. We can't cop out. It's too important of a question. So who is this Jesus? Again, C.S. Lewis writes in his book Mere Christianity. He says, I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That, C.S. Lewis says, is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let's not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He's not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So how do we reconcile this tension? And for many of us, we find the only way that holds these realities together is the one we're confronted with at Christmas time, that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with them. Name him Jesus, because he'll save his people from their sins. Jesus is the God who comes to save us. Jesus is the Prince of Peace, the wonderful counselor, the mighty God. Jesus is the Word made flesh, bringing grace and truth. Jesus is the author of history, writing himself into his own story to rescue sinners. It's not just, who are you, Jesus? What are you, Jesus? Christmas, we hear the answer. I am Emmanuel, God with you. You're not alone. I tell you the truth. My words are trustworthy and true. I'll never leave you or forsake you. I'm God. I'm love. I'm life. I've come for you. I've come to you. I am God with you. And we look back in gratitude. He came after centuries of longing and of waiting and anticipation. And the Word came and dwelt among us. He came and we look back in gratitude. How amazing is that? But we also look forward in anticipation of seeing him again. And that's the promise of Revelation 22, verse 4, that I read at the beginning. They will see his face. They'll see his face again. That's part of the Advent season. Yes, we look back, we say, wow, it's amazing. Jesus came. Look at what he did. But we also look forward. We anticipate that we'll see Jesus again. And because of that, we have hope when things are dark and hard, when it feels like we've been waiting forever. We'll see his face. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century theologian, probably one of the most influential thinkers in the Western world, an intellectual giant. The story goes that one day Thomas was praying and weeping before a cross. a crucifix with Jesus on it, when a voice came from the crucifix and said these words, "You have written well of me, Thomas. What reward will you have?" And Thomas replied, "Only yourself, Lord. Only yourself, Lord. I just want to know you. I just want to see you." See, when you meet Jesus through the Spirit, and that becomes the longing of your heart, it's that longing to see him. There was a man named William Dyke who became blind when he was around 10 years old. And when he was in college, he met the daughter of a very wealthy British admiral. Some of you know this story. This took place a long time ago. So he proposed eventually to this young woman, but before giving his blessing, the admiral insisted that William submit to what was then a very risky eye surgery. And so William agreed, but on one condition. He didn't want the bandages, the gauze to be removed until the moment when he met his bride at the altar. He wanted to be her. He wanted her to be the very first person he saw. So the surgery took, and then on the day, William's father led him to the front of the church, and the bride's father led her down the aisle. And as she came down the aisle, William's father began to unwrap the bandages, the gauze. No one knew if the surgery had been successful. So you can imagine that the tension, the suspense, the anticipation in the room. And when his bride stood before him, the last piece of gauze was removed. He opened his eyes and stood there for a moment without saying anything. And then he said, "You are more beautiful than I ever imagined." You see, the promise of Revelation 22, the longing of Advent is that one day we will see Jesus clearly. One day we will see him face to face without the binders of sin obscuring our vision. One day we'll see him in all of his beauty and all of his glory and all of his goodness. Now we only get a glimpse. We only see in part. Then we'll know him as we're fully known. No more shame, no more guilt, no more regret. We'll see him. We'll see Jesus. We'll see him in glory, more beautiful than we ever imagined. Thank you for watching today. I trust this spoke to you and strengthened you in your walk with the Lord. Click on subscribe to catch other messages that are coming up next week and the last Sunday of Advent, and then as we move into a new series in the new year. May God bless you.